So you're ready to hit the motocross track, but what bike should you actually buy for it? A 250, a 450, 2-stroke, 4-stroke, maybe even electric? It's all very confusing until you've actually ridden a few of these different bikes and felt how different they are. So in this video, I'm breaking down every single motocross bike category, what each one's good at, who it's for, and hopefully helping you find the perfect bike for you. But before we get into that, I want to tell you about Slacker. If you barely ever set your sag, you're not alone. It's an essential task that often gets overlooked because it's kind of a pain. It normally requires multiple people, you're fiddling around with balancing the bike and trying to read the tape measure all at the same time. I mean, yeah, I'd rather just be riding the bike too. Well, with the Slacker digital sag tool, you can check your sag in less than 5 minutes, all by yourself. It turns a super annoying task into a piece of cake, so you can get back to riding ASAP. And because you're watching Soup Moto, you can get your own digital sag tool for 40% off using code SOUP, S-O-U-P, at checkout. Now, back to the video. So, what type of terrain will you be riding on the motocross tracks? What do these bikes need to be able to handle? Motocross bikes are built for short, intense bursts of riding. Wide open throttle, jumps, whoops, fast corners, and relatively short motos. Usually 10 to 15 minute motos for amateurs and 20 to 30 minute motos for the pros. On the motocross track, you're going to find obstacles like rough, choppy braking bumps, deep ruts, jumps, high-speed rollers, off-camber turns, and more. Now, as a disclaimer, this video is for adults. However, a lot of the same concepts apply for youth and mini bikes. It's a very personal decision to know when it's time to move from mini bikes to big bikes. I personally moved up from my CR85 to my YZ125 at about 14 or 15 years old, but to be honest, I probably could have moved up a year earlier as I was getting pretty big for the 85 at the time. The point is, mileage may vary and each person is different, but this video is going to be talking about adult size big bikes. Now that you know what type of terrain you'll need your motocross bike to handle, what components should you be looking for in a motocross bike? You're probably looking for a full-size bike as opposed to a 3/4 sized trail bike. There are bikes like the one that I have, the CRF 250F, that is a 3/4 size bike, more meant for just casual riding. It's going to have a lot shorter seat height so people can fit on them a lot more comfortably. You're not going to want that for motocross riding. And the reason is usually these bikes don't have as much suspension travel, and they also probably don't have the level of suspension that you need to handle a lot of these things you're going to find on the motocross track. So you want to look at a full-sized bike as opposed to a 3/4 sized trail bike. You're going to usually want a 19-inch rear wheel. This is not a deal breaker, but most motocross bikes use the 19-inch rear wheel over the 18-inch, which you often find on enduro bikes or cross-country bikes. You're going to want a close ratio transmission as opposed to a wide ratio transmission. The close ratio transmission is going to allow for a lot more logical gear changes that fit better for the motocross track as opposed to what you're going to find on enduro courses or out in the woods. You're going to want capable and adjustable suspension. This is what I'm talking about as compared to those 3/4 size trail bikes. They don't usually have suspension that is capable for those big jumps, drops, braking bumps, all that harsh stuff that you're going to find on the motocross track at high speed. Whereas the full-size bikes, motocross bikes, usually have suspension that is capable for this type of riding. On motocross bikes, as opposed to enduro bikes, the suspension is actually tuned specifically for this type of riding. Now, each rider is different. You can adjust your suspension down the road to fit exactly the type of terrain you're going to be on, but at the very bare minimum, you want the suspension to be capable for motocross riding, so have enough travel and be adjustable. You're going to want a bike with explosive power, especially for 2-strokes. Motocross style riding prioritizes acceleration, so you really don't want a bike that kind of lags on the throttle. For example, a lot of the 2-stroke enduro bikes, they have a very linear and kind of lackluster power delivery that really doesn't work well for motocross riding. You want the bike to have a lot of punch. That's not to say that you want the rear tire to break loose every single time you crack the throttle, and that's why a lot of people, especially on 4-stroke motocross bikes, they end up changing the engine mapping settings in order to kind of limit that wheel spin or that breaking loose of the rear wheel. so that they can maximize traction, but you still want to have enough explosive power to get you out of the turns with enough acceleration to hit jumps and that sort of thing. Like I said, motocross prioritizes acceleration over most other things. The other thing that you want to consider is, because you're going to be finding a lot of different types of terrain and soil types in motocross, like sandy soil, loose soil, soft clay, hard pack, things like that, tire choice is key. Okay, so you could have the same bike, but if you're riding a different type of terrain and you have the wrong tire for that, it's going to perform way differently. This goes for not only motocross, it's also for other types of riding, but you want to keep that in mind. What type of soil are you going to be riding most, and choose the right tire for that soil. If you're mostly living in California riding hard pack, and then you decide you want to go to, I don't know, a whole way across the country and ride in Florida, you're going to ride a lot of sand and stuff down there. Well, you're going to have to change to a sand tire instead of riding the tire you'd choose for hard pack. So keep that in mind, no matter what bike you're on. And the last thing I want to touch on as far as components go and what you're looking for in a motocross bike is, do not ride with the wraparound metal handguards. They can be put on any type of bike. Most of the time they don't come stock from the factory, so this is more something to look out for if you're buying a bike used. If they have wraparound metal handguards, take them off immediately if you're going to be riding motocross. The reason is, if you're in a crash, usually off of like a jump or something, you don't want your hand to go down through that metal handguard and wrist gets broken or your arm gets broken or something like that. They're not really safe if you're going to be doing a lot of jumping. They're fine for in the woods, but I would not recommend them on the motocross track, because you're going to be doing a lot of jumping and it's possible for your hand to blow off the handlebar, and you don't want to have an injury because of the wraparound handguards. And really, there's no reason to have metal wraparound handguards on the motocross track. You're not going to end up hitting anything like you would a tree in enduro that would require you to have that much protection on your hands. Now, I will say, I never used to ride with any sort of handguards, but nowadays I would totally run those plastic sort of flag style handguards, not the wraparounds, just the plastic ones that they even like break off in the event of a hard crash. I would run those all the time. That's just my recommendation. Some people don't choose to run them, but to me, there's no downsides, and they protect your hands from roost and rocks and stuff like that. And if you do ever decide to go ride in the woods, you're a little bit more covered than if you had absolutely nothing on your handlebars. So I would recommend running at least the plastic handguards, but like I said, that's completely optional. Now let's look at each class of motocross bike and figure out the ideal rider for each. And just so you know, I'm gonna list every single motocross bike in the US market with current pricing at the end of the video if you wanna see how all these bikes compare. But first off, we're gonna start by comparing 250cc versus 450cc 4-stroke motocross bikes. Why you might want to choose one over the other. I'm just gonna do this pros and cons style, super simple. We'll start out with the 250cc pros. So they're gonna be lighter than the 450. They're gonna be a little bit less expensive, and in my opinion, the power is going to be more manageable, usually for beginner riders. They're less likely for you to bite off more than you can chew, so to speak. I have a little story about this, an anecdote. I was pretty young. I was on my 65 at the time. We were riding at a motocross track with my dad and a few of his friends, and my one dad's buddy, he was riding a 450. He's been riding for a long time. He was pretty experienced, but he was riding a really powerful bike. I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but at some point he got a little out of control going up to this big jump. He whiskey throttled. He started to slide off the back of the bike. He just kept twisting the throttle, and as he was trying to hang on more and more, he kept twisting the throttle more and more, and next thing you know, he flew way over this jump. It was like this big sort of step up double, maybe it could have been a triple. I can't actually remember. Like I said, I was pretty young, but what happened was, I'm not sure if he landed on the bike or off the bike, but long story short, he ended up breaking his femur, and I'm pretty sure he even broke a bunch of bones in his ankle as well, all because he bit off way more than he could chew with that 450 power, and when he whiskey throttled that thing, it sent him flying really, really far. Now, not to say that you can't whiskey throttle a 250, but when you do whiskey throttle it, you're not gonna go as far. You're not gonna get up to as high speeds. It's just a little bit more manageable. That power is more manageable. Yes, you can still get out of shape on them, but if you're a beginner rider anywhere sort of newer or you're a vet rider or whatever reason, if you're just a casual rider, in my opinion, I think the 250 has a more manageable power. You're way less likely to be able to get into a situation like I just described. Not to say it can't happen, but I think, in my opinion, the 250 has more manageable power. With that being said, it's more manageable. However, because it's a smaller displacement, it needs to be ridden a little bit more precisely. So it forces you to learn that throttle and clutch control. I see this as a pro personally, and this is the same reason I recommend 125 two-strokes to a lot of newer riders, but that could be seen as a con as well. I see it as a pro because it actually forces you to learn good throttle and clutch control. Now, what are the cons of a 250? Well, the same thing. They need to be ridden more precisely. So it's more work when you're riding. You have to make sure you're revving it out more to carry your momentum. You have to make sure you're carrying momentum around a turn to be able to hit certain jumps and stuff because they don't have as much power. That could be seen as a con as well. They're also ridden harder and more wide open a lot of the time. So in theory, there's more strain on that engine, and that could lead to more frequent top end rebuilds. Not necessarily, depending on the rider and what your habits are and that sort of thing, but I think as a general rule, people are often revving the 250s out more than they are the 450s. Also, the 250s do lack power needed for some jumps, like right out of tight corners, big uphills, pulls, like large uphill straightaway section, and then a jump at the top of it. They're lacking a little power. You're gonna need to make up for that power with your technique, or you're just not gonna be able to hit certain jumps. The other thing about 250s that's a con is they might be too sluggish for bigger riders that are taller, riders that are heavier. The engine might just be struggling a bit more than if someone was a lighter rider. Bigger riders might actually need more of that power in order to carry them. And that's where the 450 comes in. Here are the pros of the 450 in my opinion. They can be ridden less precisely, whereas the 250, you gotta be very precise with your throttle. You gotta be kind of riding on the top end, sort of winding that engine out a little more. The 450, you don't really have to do that. You can lug them a little more. You can stay in one gear for longer. You don't really have to ride them as precisely. Also, engine mapping can usually solve that bite off more than you can chew problem. So in theory, the newer bikes with the customizable engine maps, you could sort of detune your 450 so that it's limited, I think. To be honest, I don't have experience doing this, but some people in the comments told me that this is possible to do. And it makes sense. I mean, you could limit the power that the 450 could output, or at least just make it roll on a little smoother. And in that case, you could make it less likely that you're going to get out of hand with all that power. Like I said before, more power equals more possibilities. So you can basically do anything the track throws at you. There's really not many motocross tracks out there that a 450 can't, with the right rider, do all of the obstacles on that track, if that makes sense. If you have good throttle control, the 450s are able to be ridden a little bit smoother. You don't have to rev them out as much like you would on a 250. So you have to have good throttle control for this, but they can be ridden a little bit smoother depending on the terrain. And there's a lot of factors at this. And then, like we said before, less engine strain because you're not revving them out as much as a 250. In theory, there's going to be less strain on the engine and less frequent engine work that will need to be done to them. Now, the cons of the 450 are they're obviously going to be more expensive. They're going to be heavier, and some people might say that they're a little bit harder to handle because they're heavier. Oftentimes, to be honest, I'm in the camp of even though a bike is heavier, that doesn't always mean that it's harder to handle. Usually at speed, you don't even notice the weight of the bike. That's my opinion. Obviously, results may vary depending on the bike you're talking about. Some bikes really do feel heavier, some bikes don't. Some people mention when they're talking about cons of the 450, yeah, they can be a little heavier, so that might be a disadvantage. Now, for a lighter, smaller rider, the 450 is going to be a lot of bike to handle. That's just the truth of it. The same way that a 250 might be a little bit too small and sluggish for a bigger or heavier rider, it's the opposite on a 450. That is just a lot of bike for a smaller rider to handle. Now, if it's not mapped to be more tame, the power is going to be less manageable and it's easier to get out of control. So that's a con in my opinion. The last thing I would say, it doesn't really teach you the fundamentals of throttle, clutch control, gear selection, as well as smaller displacement motorcycles. Now, that's just my opinion, and you could argue that the 450 is still able to teach you things like proper body position, carrying momentum and other stuff like that. And that's definitely true. But as far as it goes with throttle control, clutch control, gear selection, I think the smaller displacement bikes are going to teach you those things way better than the 450. So those are the pros and cons of the 250 versus 450. And I can already hear some of you screaming, Soup, what about the 350? Well, I've never gotten the chance to ride one personally, but from everything I've heard, the 350 4-stroke motocross bike would actually be the perfect middle ground choice for someone who is riding mostly motocross, who has a little bit of riding experience. It might not be the perfect choice for a complete beginner, but intermediate level riders or even most vet riders, I think the 350 pretty much balances out all of those pros and cons that we just talked about between the 250 and the 450. If you have the budget for one and you like the feel of those Austrian chassis, I think the 350 is a pretty solid choice. In fact, I would love to ride one at some point, possibly even own one. The only real cons that I could see with the 350 are being forced to race in the open class. Number one, you wouldn't be able to race it against 250s, but that's not really a huge con if I'm being honest. Maybe the only other con would be the lack of parts availability and support, since it's not super common in the North American market. Not to say that you can't find parts, it's just they're not as ubiquitous as 250s and 450s because those bikes are more common. So with that being said, we talked about 4 strokes. Let's move over to 2 strokes. What about the 125, the 150 versus the 250 2-stroke? So the 125s or the 150s, the pros of those bikes are they're going to be lighter, more affordable. They teach the fundamentals better, throttle control, clutch control, gear selection. Those are going to sound really familiar to the 250 4-stroke pros. Also, I think the 125 or the 150 2-strokes are pretty much the perfect amount of bike for smaller and lighter riders, those riders who are just moving up from minis up to big bikes. It gives you that big bike chassis, but the power delivery and the amount of bike, the lightness, the nimbleness of those bikes is very similar to what riders would have been used to on super minis or even smaller bikes, but it just gives you that big chassis. And they're also going to have more nimble handling. The cons of these bikes could be more frequent engine work, top ends. They need to be ridden very precisely, more work to ride, obviously. They don't haul bigger or heavier riders around that well. They lack power to tackle certain obstacles on some tracks. Those are all basically the same cons as the 250 4-stroke compared to the 450. And the last con, as the 125 and the 150 goes, they're not very competitive against 250 4-strokes. So if you're going to be racing them outside of like a 125cc class or like a schoolboy 1 class, if you're just racing them in like 250C, 250B, 250A, whatever, you're not going to be as competitive on the 2-stroke against those 450s. Now, what about the 250 2-stroke? Well, you're going to have less frequent engine work and top ends slightly. I mean, it's not 1-to-1, it's not that big of a difference, but same principle applies. You're not going to be riding these bikes as hard, wringing them out as much, so you're going to have to do engine maintenance a little bit less frequently. They don't need to be ridden as precisely. They're going to haul heavier and bigger riders better. It does have enough power to tackle most obstacles, similar to the 450s. And I would say the 250 2-stroke is more competitive against 450s as compared to the 125s or 150s versus the 250 4-strokes, if that makes sense. So if you were gonna choose a 2-stroke over a 4-stroke and you wanted to still be competitive against most people in 4-stroke classes, I would probably go for the 250 2-stroke. Depending on where you're at and what series you're running, technically the 250 2-stroke can be raced against 250 4-stroke classes. For example, you could run a 250 2-stroke in like 250C, 250B, 250A, whatever, if you want to be a rotten sandbagger. Okay, there, I said it. That's my opinion. I don't know. Other people might have different opinions than me on that. I think that's sandbagging, but that's just me. The cons of a 250 2-stroke, they're going to be less nimble than the 125s and 150s, although still pretty great. That's just a marginal difference. They're going to be a little more expensive, and I think the 250 2-strokes are going to be more bike and power than a beginner could handle effectively. It's not really a good option for beginners learning the fundamentals. Same reason I wouldn't recommend a 450 to a beginner. 250 2-stroke is going to be kind of the same deal. This is in the motocross world. Now, if we're talking enduro riding, that's a completely different story, and I can make a different video on that in the future. But when it comes to motocross, I think beginners could really get out of hand with a 250 2-stroke. So I would push them more towards either the 250 4-stroke or something like a 125 2-stroke or a 150 2-stroke. All right, with that being said, let's just talk more broadly. What about 2-strokes versus four strokes versus electric bikes, because we haven't discussed the electric bike yet. Let's zoom out a little and just talk in general. What are the pros of a two-stroke? Well, they're usually lighter than four strokes. They're usually more affordable overall. They're usually simpler to work on because they have less complex engines. And they're also usually cheaper to maintain and rebuild. Now, what are the cons of a two-stroke? Yes, they're simpler to work on and they're more affordable, but they usually have more frequent maintenance intervals. So you're gonna have to be doing the maintenance a little bit more. You're gonna be replacing top ends a little more frequently and that sort of thing. But like I said, it's usually way easier to do. Now, they're often carbureted, so you're not gonna get any engine mapping. You're not gonna get the advantage of having that fuel injection. However, there are a lot of two-strokes like the KTMs and what have you, the Austrian bikes, that are fuel injected now. So that's not necessarily a con for all of them, but carbureted bikes are a little more finicky to work on and get tuned in. They have some downsides as compared to fuel injected bikes that the four strokes, most of the time nowadays, all the four strokes are going to be fuel injected. And you have that customizable engine mapping. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think, even though some of those KTMs are fuel injected nowadays, I don't think the two strokes are able to have that customized engine mapping the way the four strokes do. Like I said, I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. The other con two strokes have, like I said, I think they're less competitive overall in four-stroke dominated classes, and by far in motocross, the four strokes are the most popular bikes as far as competitive racing goes. So if you get a two-stroke, not to say that you can't be competitive, but if we're just talking averages, you're going to be less competitive. Rider to rider, class to class, race to race, obviously it depends on your competition. You could still win on a two-stroke. That's obviously not something that I would argue, but I would say just averages wise, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage in the four-stroke dominated classes. The other thing, just as far as rideability goes, the two strokes are often going to have less linear and predictable power as compared to the four strokes. So you're not going to be as smooth when you're riding it. So if that's your style and you're a smooth rider, then you're going to have a disadvantage on the two-stroke as compared to the four-stroke. Now, what are the pros of a four-stroke? Well, as I mentioned, they're the most competitive in the current class configurations. Now, that's a different discussion for another day. I could talk on and on about how the AMA has the classes structured and what's sandbagging and what's not. And a lot of people comment and say, well, the four strokes are cheating because of the way that the governing body set up the class and whatever. Okay, I'm just living in reality here, and we're talking strictly what the current bounds of the racing scene is right now. Four strokes are the most competitive in the current configuration. I'll leave it at that. A lot of four strokes have electric start. That's kind of just a quality of life thing. Doesn't really matter as much because we're doing live engine starts in motocross as opposed to dead engine starts, but quality of life thing, most four strokes have electric start. Some two strokes don't, although newer ones that are fuel injected like the KTMs, they do have electric start. The other thing is the four strokes have electronic fuel injection with customizable engine mapping. That's a pretty cool thing. Another cool thing is they sometimes have traction control, launch control, those sorts of things available to the four-stroke bike that I really haven't seen on two-stroke bikes. The other thing is manufacturer contingency. If you're racing at a high level, you're buying that brand new model year of bike every year, this may be a concern to you. I'm not sure. Obviously, it depends on the series, the manufacturer. If they're paying out contingency on certain two strokes, it's very possible that they could be. But I think for the most part, it seems like it's just current model year, possibly even the last model year. So for example, like next season, it'll be the 2026s and the 2025 models that they'll usually pay out contingency for. And it's usually just the four-stroke models, the 250s and the 450s. I could be wrong. Depending on your series, they may also pay out the two-stroke models, but it seems like that's the way the contingency goes. So if you care about contingency, probably going to want to go with the four-stroke. Like I said, they have more linear, predictable power. So these four strokes favor smoother riders rather than riders who just are blowing out the berm all the time, just revving it wide open. Not to say that one style of riding is better or worse, because obviously we've seen very successful riders with both styles, but the four-stroke definitely favors more smoother riding, linear, predictable power across the board. And like I said, less frequent maintenance intervals. So that's something to think about as well. Now, let's get into the cons of a four-stroke, because there are cons. They're not all rainbows and sunshine. They are going to be more expensive to just purchase straight up than the two strokes. They're also heavier than the two strokes. In my opinion, not really usually a big deal. Although smaller riders, lighter riders may notice that they're not able to throw them around as easily as they would rebuild a two-stroke. They're also more complicated to work on and rebuild. Now, obviously it depends what maintenance you're doing. Not to say that all maintenance on a four-stroke is complicated, it's not, but if you're gonna do a whole engine rebuild, it's gonna be way more complicated than it would be on a two-stroke. And obviously they're also gonna be more expensive to rebuild and work on. Those are cons of the four-stroke. Now, some of you are gonna love this, some of you are gonna hate it, but what about electric bikes? Are they ruining the sport? That's also another video for another day. But I'm strictly just gonna talk about what I see as the pros and the cons of electric bikes, specifically the Stark Varg, because that is pretty much the only competitive electric bike in the motocross racing scene at this current moment that is widely available to the consumer, mass produced, that sort of thing. So the first pro, they basically have no maintenance other than chassis stuff. You still gotta change the tires, you still gotta adjust the suspension, you still gotta replace the chain and the sprockets every once in a while, brake pads, that sort of thing. But as far as engine maintenance goes, you're never gonna have any maintenance to do really on the motor. The other pro, which is awesome, is completely customizable power. The same way that you can engine map on four strokes, you can do even to a greater degree, and you can make that power deliver exactly how you want, the whole way down to the power curve. You can limit the power to a certain horsepower, you can make it more snappy, more instant if you need it, you can make it more mellow and chilled out if you don't, and that's awesome to be able to do. That's a huge pro of electric bikes. Now the Stark Varg particularly has a great chassis. It is amazing. It feels awesome to ride, in my opinion. So I would say, in my opinion, that's a pro for the Stark Varg. Electric bikes, not so much in general, but just the Stark Varg has a fantastic chassis. The other pro is going to be you do have snappy, instantaneous power if you need it. That is completely different to four strokes or two strokes. It's out of this world in comparison. Immediately there, immediately instant acceleration. The electric bikes have gas-powered bikes beat by a long shot. And because of that, you got a crazy whole shot advantage on electric bikes. Those are the pros of electric bikes, specifically the Stark Varg. Let's get into the cons. They are going to be pretty expensive. Now, when you're talking about 450 four strokes from KTM and like Ducati and stuff like that, it's going to be comparable to that price. So depending on what kind of bike you buy, it might not really matter to you. But if you're buying like 125 two strokes or 250 four strokes, the Stark is going to be a lot more expensive. Now, obviously, this is the one that everyone talks about, and that is range and charging time. So gas powered bike aficionados and riders who are completely against electric bikes, they're always going to be like, well, can you fill up the gas tank in 30 seconds and then immediately go back out for another moto? Obviously you can't do that on the Stark Varg, but those same average riders are going to go out for a 30-minute moto, let's say on the motocross track, and they're going to be completely exhausted. Then they're going to get off the track and they're going to go eat a sandwich, or they're going to drink their Gatorade or whatever they do back at the truck, and they're going to sit there for another 15, 20, maybe even 30 minutes before they even get enough energy to get back on the track again. And in that time, an electric bike could be sitting back at the truck, plugged into a generator, and charge it up to a point where it can go out and do another 30 minutes maybe. So is that really an issue for the motocross rider? In my opinion, not really, especially the average rider. Now, if you're like a pro and that sort of thing, obviously this might not apply because you are able to go out and do longer motos and that sort of thing without getting tired. But the average rider on the motocross track, I think the Stark Varg battery is going to outrun that rider. Obviously, mileage may vary. Not everyone is the same. Some people are going to demand more out of the bike than others. If you're riding deep, loamy sand and stuff, it's going to drain the battery even more. Muddy conditions, you get the idea. It depends, okay? But it's not black and white like a lot of people might make you think. The other thing, and this is rapidly changing, so it's not really something I'd worry about moving forward, but you may not be eligible to race these in certain series. That's definitely a con, but I do see that changing, and either people race series is adding their own electric class or just allowing the electric bikes to run in the open class, which I think is what a lot of series are doing. They're just allowing it to run in the open class. I do think that's rapidly changing, but that is something to think about. If something does go wrong with the bike, the average person, the average mechanic that might know everything there is to know about gas-powered bikes is not really going to be able to know how to work on the electric bike. So repairs are really going to be call up Stark, ask for whatever part you need. They'll probably troubleshoot and diagnose it and tell you what part you need to buy or whatever. I have heard that with Stark, the customer service is pretty good. So if you do break something and it's kind of like their fault or like a failure of the bike, usually it seems like they replace it without charging you. But I don't really know the specifics because I don't own one and I haven't had to deal with customer service and all that stuff. But the point of this is, a big con is that the average person, because it's electrical and not that many people have electrical skills, they're not going to know how to work on it and make repairs and that sort of thing. Now, as the future goes on and this technology becomes more and more common, people are probably going to be able to do fixes themselves more often. But as it stands right now, I mean, you be the judge. Do you know how to work on an electric motor? I don't. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is they fully rely on throttle control. There's no ability to modulate the clutch that doesn't have a clutch. There are some companies that are making a sort of digital clutch, I guess, but for the most part, you can't rely on the clutch. So if you're someone that really heavily rides using the clutch, and that's one of the tools in your toolbox, you're going to have to like basically relearn how you ride a dirt bike, because the electric bike is completely different. It relies fully on throttle control. That could be seen as a con, but really once you figure out how to ride it, it's not really that big of a deal. So that's the electric bikes. I hope all of that information gives you a better idea which class of motocross bike is right for you. Now I want to share the actual makes and models with you so you can go and research them by yourself. I'll be listing every single motocross bike in the North American market with the most current pricing I could find. But before we get into that, if you enjoyed this video so far and you want to see more like it, please drop a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And speaking of the channel, if you'd like to help keep Soup Moto alive, take a look at my links in the description for ways to contribute. I have Soup Moto t-shirts for sale, and I also have a handful of affiliate links to buy your favorite dirt bike products from. So let's get into this list, and let's start with the 250 4-strokes. Now, as far as 250 4-stroke motocross bikes go, you have the Yamaha YZ250F at $8,899, the Honda CRF 250R, $8,399, the Kawasaki KX250, $9,099. And by the way, these are US dollar prices. KTM 250 SXF, $10,699. The Husqvarna FC250, $10,499. The Gas MC250F, $9,599. The Suzuki RMZ250, $8,299. The Triumph TF250X, $9,495. So you can see that's sort of the range of pricing you're going to get with the 250 4-strokes. Now let's go to the 450 4-strokes. You're going to have the Yamaha YZ450F for $10,299, the Honda CRF 450R for $9,699, the Kawasaki KX450 for $10,599, the KTM 450 SXF for $11,649, the Husqvarna FC450 for $11,399, the Gas MC450F for $10,499, the Suzuki RMZ 450 for $9,399, the Triumph TF450X for $10,695, the Ducati Desmo 450 MX for $11,495, the Beta 450 RX for $10,990. So as you can see, that's a significant jump in price from the 250 4-strokes. Now let's talk about the 350 4-strokes. You got the KTM 350 SXF for $11,499. You got the Husqvarna FC350 for $11,199. You got the Gas MC350F for $10,299. Kind of that middle ground between them, but they are all the Austrian bikes, the KTM sort of family, and so they're all going to be pretty pricey. Now let's move to something a little less pricey. You got the 125 or 150 2-stroke motocross bikes. So what's interesting is we got the KTM 125 SX and the 150 SX for $8,449, the same price, which I thought maybe I was not finding the right prices. I thought I was mistaken, because the Gas MC 125 is $7,599 and the Gas MC 150 is $7,849. So I was like, okay, maybe I got the KTM pricing wrong, but no, I think they actually are the same price, because the Husqvarna TC 125 and the TC 150 are also the same price at $8,549. So I'm not really sure what the difference is there. Then you got the Yamaha YZ 125 for $7,199. It's going to be the cheapest out of all of them, but it's also going to be the most bare bones. The technology hasn't changed as much in the past multiple decades as compared to the KTM sort of umbrella of bikes. In the 250 two-stroke bike category, you got the Yamaha YZ250 at $8,099. You got the KTM 250 SX, $9,649. You got the Husqvarna TC250, $9,749. The Gas MC 250, $8,649. The Beta 250 RX, $9,690. And the Beta 350 RX, $10,290. Now, this is not a bike that we talked about, but the Beta 350 RX is actually a 350cc two-stroke, which is meant to be a little more comparable with the 450 four-stroke motocross bikes. It's brand new, it's just released. I don't really know much about it. I've never gotten the chance to ride one, but that is something to think about if you're a two-stroke person, you really like two-strokes, but you still want to be competitive in those four-stroke classes. Well, check out the Beta 350 RX. Now, and last but not least, we got the Stark Varg. I'm going to be talking about the MX 1.2, the newest release, and as of November 2025, the price is $11,990. Now, from what I know about Starks, they change their pricing a lot. A lot of times they discount previous models and that stuff pretty heavily, so this might not be the case, but as of November 2025, $11,990. So anyway, that's all for now. You have that information. You can go out and research the group of bikes that you think would best fit you. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments below. Thanks for watching.